Okay, so welcome everyone, more officially and formally, to this webinar called Partnership Negotiation: How to be an Agent of Social Change Without Resorting to Domination Tactics. My name is Sara Saltee. I'm the Director of Leadership and Learning Programs at the Center for Partnership Studies, and I'll be playing the role of moderator today and seeing what we can do to keep our conversation flowing, not only between Riane and Karen, but also with all of you as we go along. This topic about partnership negotiation, of course, I hope feels very timely to all of you, and from seeing the kind of work that many of you are doing, I know that it's right at the sort of nexus of what you do in terms of working with other people to shift dynamics, to make change, and to work in partnership. So many of us today are feeling activated not only to resist the dangerous regressions and extreme domination tactics we're witnessing every day in the news, but really to co-create better ways of working together at every level, in families, at work, in our communities, in our nation, our relationships with other nations, and with the earth. And today I know we'll all come away with new ways of understanding not only what we're working toward, but how we can do that work together in mutually respectful partnerships without resorting to the tactics of control and domination that we can so easily default to. And I'm particularly personally looking forward to learning more from Karen and Riane about what neuroscience is telling us now about how our brains are shaped by our social conditioning and how we can intentionally repattern our responses and behaviors. So before I introduce Karen and Riane and jump into the meat of the content here, I do want to just take a moment and express our gratitude to the organizations who are co-sponsors of this event, who helped us get the word out, get many of you to the table today or to the room with us, and really supporting this work in general. So we have Karen's organizations of Clairvoyant Leadership and Quantum Negotiation, Ariana Newcomer's organization, Reclaiming the Wise Woman Elder, is a co-sponsor. Deanna Burleson's company, Full Spectrum Solutions, the Isaac Walton League of America, the Global Community Initiative, which is connected with Gwen Hallsmith, as well as Vermonters for a New Economy. Thank you, Gwen, again for your co-sponsorship through that organization. Also, the Experience Accelerators with Sarah Schwab, responsive.org, the Phoenix chapter, and Meridian University is also a co-sponsor today. And if you're here today from any one of those organizations or companies, please say a special hello in the chat so we can share our appreciation there as well. And speaking of the chat stream, I also want to thank our colleagues Ann Amberg of CPS and Jason Campbell, who's working with Karen at Quantum Negotiation and is also a partnership leader, was an important person in bringing this all together. Anne and Jason, you will meet in the chat today. They're not on camera, but they'll be sharing links and responding to your comments and questions as we go along today. So thank you also to Jason and Anne. And thank all of you who are with us live or watching us in replay. It's delightful to have you with us for this important conversation. So we bring together today two extraordinary and inspiring women whose work has some really fascinating resonance, Riane Eisler and Karen Walch. I'm going to introduce them very briefly and then invite each of them to give us a little bit longer introduction, sharing more about the sort of foundational pieces of their work that will help us then build a more elaborate conversation on top of that foundation. I'll then be sparking some additional conversation with a few questions that we've prepared in advance. And when we're complete with those, I want to flag for all of you who are with us that we will be turning to your questions, starting with a couple that were sent in advance. And I think, Jason, if you would please mute yourself on, I think you're on a couple different devices, and we need to have you mute on both because we're getting a little noise from your end. Thanks. For those of you listening, please keep track of your questions that pop up if your curiosity is triggered by something that you hear and you want to learn more, or you'd like to see the conversation move in a particular direction. Please share it, jot it down for yourself, or just jot it down in the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we have time for in the second part of our webinar today. So, from the Center for Partnership Studies, we welcome Riane Eisler. Riane is internationally known as a systems scientist, an attorney working for the rights of women and children, an author of groundbreaking books such as The Chalice and the Blade, which many of you referenced in your opening introductions today, and also The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics, as well as many other wonderful books. Dr. Eisler is president of the Center for Partnership Studies, which is dedicated to research and education on social and economic transformation. She's the co-founder of CPS's Caring Economy campaign, and with Nobel Peace Laureate Betty Williams, she's the co-founder of the Spiritual Alliance to Stop Intimate Violence, or SAVE. Riane is also the editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, an online peer-reviewed journal which is housed at the University of Minnesota that was inspired by Riane's work. And she is a frequent national and international speaker and contributor to many international initiatives around peace and equity. We also welcome Dr. Karen Walch, who is a partner at Clairvoyant Leadership and co-creator of quantum negotiation certification programs. She's the co-author of the best-selling book, Quantum Negotiation, The Art of Getting What You Need, and is an emeritus faculty member of the Thunderbird School of Global Management. She develops and delivers negotiation and collaborative leadership courses for MBA, master's level, MA and MS, and EMBA as programs, as well as certificate programs around the world. So a master teacher of her work. So Riane and Karen, as you know, we thought we'd begin with an opportunity for each of you to speak briefly about your own backgrounds and about the big questions that your work grapples with. And Riane, we thought we'd start with you. And I know you have some, we've prepared some slides to support that. So let me pull those up now and have us start there. So welcome, Riane.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone. And I want to say it's such a pleasure to be with all of you, and to, well, I want to thank Sarah, I want to thank Karen, Jason, and I want to say I see so many familiar names out there. So a very special hello to those of you that I know. And of course, the question was, to both Karen and me, to have us start on a personal note. And that's what I'm going to do. I think some of you are familiar with the fact that my research is very, very deeply rooted in my own early childhood experiences as a refugee from in terms of the conceptual framework that I've introduced in my work, that was a massive regression to the domination side of the partnership domination social scale. It was the rise to power of the Nazis, first in Germany and then in my native Austria. And from one day to the next, my whole world was just shattered. And I watched a gang of Gestapo men drag my father away. My mother obtained his release by a miracle. By a miracle, we escaped Europe went to Cuba. I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where I experienced, of course, another traumatic experience, suddenly being plunged into poverty in a strange land. And all of these experiences led me, well, to the questions that you see on this screen, is why, when we humans have such great capacities for consciousness, caring, and creativity, why has there been so much cruelty, insensitivity, and destructiveness? And my research really was an attempt to answer that question. Can I have the next slide, please? And what I found out, well, in one sentence, among other things, is that we've been stuck in the wrong story. I found that the struggle for our future is not between right and left, religious and secular, Eastern and Western, Northern and Southern, capitalist and socialist, because if you really think about it, there have been repressive, oppressive, violent regimes in every one of these categories. So when I started my research, I quickly realized this, and I actually drew from a much larger database than conventional studies of society, which bizarrely leave out the situation of the majority of humanity, women and children. And what I found, and can I please have the next slide, because I'm going to go through this at the speed of light with you. Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, we've already talked about the domination partnership social scale, and I'm here, I do want to make a point. No society is a pure partnership or domination configuration, but there are some characteristic configurations. We see the domination configuration in very, very diverse societies, certainly Nazi Germany, Khomeini's Iran, the Taliban of Afghanistan, Stalin's Soviet Union. And we also can see the partnership configuration, I mean, not ideal, but a more peaceful, more equitable, more gender balanced way of life in most of our history. That's part of the wrong story we've been told. And by the way, I have a new book coming out, Nurturing Our Humanity, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, with Oxford University Press, which really goes way back, because in the Chalice and the Blade I went back only about 30,000 years. And in this new book, we go back millennia. But can I have the next slide, please? But once we take into account, as I said, the situation of the majority of humanity, we see configurations. We see that, yes, it's not coincidental that whether it was not Hitler in Germany or Khomeini in Iran or the Taliban in Afghanistan, or for that matter, Stalin in the former Soviet Union, or Mr. Trump, that basically what you see is this push back to a family economic and social structure that is authoritarian. I mean, you see this ranking based with rigid hierarchies of domination in not only top-down economics and a top-down society, but in the family. And yes, the family is, as we know from neuroscience, and both Karen and I will get back to that, really has an awful lot to do. We are finding out from neuroscience with nothing less than how our brains develop. And this takes me to not only childhood, but gender. When you have the ranking of male over female and rigid gender stereotypes with the so-called masculine, right? Like toughness and conquest, ranked over feminine ones, supposedly feminine ones, such as caring and nonviolence, this is embedded in children's brains. Now, fortunately, a lot of people are able, well, some people are able to transcend that, but unfortunately, many people are not. And so we get these bizarre economic priorities where there's always money for prisons, the punitive male head of household of the traditional family, or prisons, prisons, weapons, the hero, the masculinity equated with domination, with violence. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for people, for keeping a clean and healthy environment. They quote women's work, right? I mean, because women are supposed to keep that environment in the home. And yes, there's a high level of abuse, fear, and violence because, all the way from child and wife beating to abuse by superiors in families, workplaces, societies, chronic wars, because it's needed to maintain these rigid rankings of domination. And yes, narratives and language, beliefs and stories we've been all told that justify and idealize domination and violence, which are sort of, plus the gender stereotypes, plus the punitive family. It's all deemed to be inevitable, moral, and desirable. Can I have the next slide? The partnership systems configuration, and I think it's important that you have this background because, of course, what you will be hearing from Karen, which is so fascinating, is really how we can leave behind our domination conditioning. Because in that mindset, there are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. You either win or you lose. There is no partnership alternative. And you also learn to identify with the bully because you're comfortable with that from your early experiences. By contrast, as we move more to the partnership side, whether it's ancient societies, whether it's societies that today are moving more in that direction, and we see trends right here. So many of you are involved in really accelerating the cultural transformation from domination to partnership. But if we look at nations, you see that nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway, that not coincidentally have the lowest gender gaps, that not coincidentally introduced the first laws that said it's against the law to use physical discipline against children in families, that these societies actually are always not only have rank very high in the happiness rankings, but they also rank very high in the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. In other words, the partnership system, contrary to everything that we constantly is hammered into us, really is more effective, more productive, healthier. So you have a different family and economic and social structure. You have the equal valuing of male and female with fluid gender roles. There's movement towards that now. And yes, a high valuing of empathy, caring, caregiving, and nonviolence in both women and men, as well as in social and economic policy. And you have a low degree of fear, abuse, and violence. There is some, people lose it sometimes, but they're not built into the system because they're not needed to maintain these top-down rankings. So this movement towards diversity, valuing human rights, is part of the partnership movement, isn't it? And of course, very different narratives, which really is what we're going to be hearing in the rest of this session. And I think I've used my 5 minutes, but can we just go quickly to the next slide, the last slide, if we may? Because if once you have this understanding, you see that there are some cornerstones that have been ignored. Childhood, gender economics, but very different economics. In my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, I speak of a caring economics, because there's nothing in either socialism or capitalism about the value, the economic value of caring for people starting in early childhood, done in families, done in communities, or for that matter, about the economic value of caring for our planet, for nature. And yes, narratives and language, which takes me directly to our next speaker, to Karen.
Thank you, Riane. And thank you for inviting our quantum community into your community. I see a lot of our quantum folks there, and I'm so happy to meet everybody in your community. So much to talk to you about, Riane. This is great. And I just wanted to say a little bit about my personal story. I grew up in a very small town, rural economy, where I grew up with a lot of sharing and caring in a community where the gender roles were very fluid. Women worked outside and men helped at the housework. And where I really learned a lot about the domination and abuse structure was working in a law firm. Once I left that community and went into a law firm, and then I put myself through school and I studied social change and development. And through that experience, I learned that domination, hierarchy, through the whole world of social science, that this is very indelible in our history, and how many interesting things happened around the globe and in the world that were in a resistance to the domination mode. So to me, social change was about resisting the domination mode. And that made me extremely interested to keep going on to graduate school, but I had to choose a field. And the only field I could find that studied power, which what I thought was I was studying power and social change, the only field that really studied power was political science. So I went down the track of political science. And what I learned is that power means that you can make someone do something they necessarily would not do. And this is where I learned about the structure, not only institutions, but in our brains, the zero-sum scarcity assumptions, that it's absolutely important as a leader, or important if you want to be successful, you need to win at all costs. So leadership means being able to win at all costs. So as I started to study power in political science, I was starting to understand that when someone has a social, political, or economic means to punish and reward others, then you can get compliance. That's success. And that felt so unsatisfactory to me. It just didn't compute with how I saw much of the world working. And then I happened to start finding political psychology. And what I learned is not the scarce resources that creates conflict and our need to win in a scarce resource world. I learned that it's our perception of those limited resources that we can share and that we can care and that we can network to create resources. And then I found the chalice and the blade. I was so happy when I found the work that you were doing to show that this is really just part of our long cycles of history, and to really study. And I went down the track then of looking at political psychology, looking at anthropology, and studied the tension between domination and partnership, coercion and caring. And what I have learned over time is that we have such an innate human capacity to share unlimited resources. And there's many stories in history that show us this, and that we have a natural motivation to share and to care. And as you were saying, Riane, so much of it is about a particular kind of social conditioning. So why this has been important in political science is that over the centuries, we tend to really look at being successful by adopting military strategy or adopting domination and defensive strategies in negotiation, for example. And then this gets translated not only to military strategy, then it comes to our work strategy, it comes to the home strategy, it comes to community strategy. And what I've noticed is that the more conscious we are of the historical and the current practices about domination, the institutions don't really focus on finding mutual needs or finding ways to expand our human potential. So Sara, if you just want to show a copy of the book, I just wanted to say that this experience, writing the quantum negotiation book, is the culmination of this long journey I have just had in my lifetime to look at how negotiation today is really more about our humanity as opposed to being able to defend ourselves, to dominate others. And as Riane and I are going to talk about in a few minutes, we're going to look at how the human sciences today are building a framework about changing our frame on the way that we think about domination in negotiation. So thank you so much for the chance to be a part of this experience today.
Thank you, Karen and Riane, for setting the stage in such a juicy way for so much great conversation. We thought we'd talk a little bit next about this question of neuroscience and have you share from your different perspectives what is it that neuroscience is now telling us about how we shape our responses to others, the power of social conditioning within these domination or partnership frames, and what we're learning about our brains tell us about what it means or how it works to intentionally or mindfully alter those default responses or begin to make those kind of personal level or interactive level shifts. And I think, Riane, we thought we'd start with you.
Okay. Well, that really takes me to my new book. I told you I would talk about it. I wonder, Sara, if you have the cover someplace on the slides. Well, we'll send it to you. Actually, you can pre-order it. This is a commercial. At a discount of 30% by using a code that we'll send you after this directly from Oxford University Press. But what that book does, just to really set the stage for what I'm going to say, it combines my findings from my research on the partnership domination social scale with what we today are learning from neuroscience about how our brains develop. So the subtitle of the book is How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. And my co-author in this book is the anthropologist Douglas Fry, who's probably the world's leading expert on something very, very important, foraging or gathering, hunting or hunting-gathering societies, which is how we lived for millennia. And he calls them the original partnership societies. Now, if you look at them through the conventional lens, they don't fit any place. But if you look at them through the lens of what we have introduced in this new book, in Nurturing Our Humanity, the biocultural partnership domination lens, what you see is that they were, for millennia, this was so different from the conventional story that we're told by most social biologists and evolutionary psychologists, that somehow we have evolutionary imperatives, to rape, to pillage, to be warlike. These were peaceful societies. They were more gender balanced, and they were not top-down societies. And we still see this in contemporary foraging societies. So what are we learning from neuroscience? I'll refer back to what Karen alluded to. One of the most interesting things, again, is a completely different story from the original sin, selfish genes story, is that actually the default setting for humans is more towards the empathic, caring, sharing side. Now, this is really so fundamental. And once we understand this, we can also understand that the domination system, in a sense, goes against, if you will, the direction of evolution. And we can change that. Cultures are human creations. Families, economics, governments, we created these. We're a very, very remarkable species. But if we have this default setting, then the question is, well, why is it that so many people, they for them, there's just this mindset, that there is no partnership alternative, that's, quote, human nature. And it starts with their early childhood experiences. Why do you think that these repressive, regressive regimes, whether they're Eastern or Western, Northern or Southern, capitalist or socialist, the China, the former Soviet Union, were the big mass applications of socialism, why do you think that they all have this sort of top-down traditional family emphasis and these gender stereotypes? Now, we're seeing trends all over the world forward. That's the part of the partnership movement. So what we have to understand is what Karen spoke about, social conditioning, starting very early on. And we can change this. And that's why those four cornerstones start with childhood and gender, with what's, if you really think about it, it's very peculiar. But gender studies only really started, women's studies, about 50 years ago, out of about 700 years of so-called modern science. As for child development, it's still siloed in our universities. It needs to be part of political science, part of sociology, part of every single discipline, which is what this new book, Nurturing Our Humanity, does, by the way, which I think has to be the wave of the future, but it won't be the wave of the future unless we make it happen. And the question, of course, is exactly what I'm going to hand it over to you, Karen, in a moment. So the question for us is really what kind of teachings, what kind of stories, what kind of family and childhood, what kind of gender relations, what kind of economics, and yes, again, what kinds of beliefs and stories and language do we need so that our conditioning and the conditioning of our children changes. And I just want to say one last thing. I've emphasized the importance, it is vital, of childhood experiences. But the good thing is that for many people, not everyone, some people are just hermetically sealed and so damaged by the domination system that it's really awfully hard for them to change, although there is anecdotal evidence that even white supremacists and anti-Semites can actually change. And we see it. There are people who have done that, who were really brainwashed. But the good news is that we can change in our adult lives. And with that, I want to hand it over to you, Karen.
Yeah, isn't the research in this field amazing, Riane? It's just incredible. And that's why it's been so exciting to work with you on this, because you're very interested in taking the anthropology and bringing in the neuroscience with it. It's just genius what you're doing with it. And I've been very interested in watching where all the various sciences are going. And this is where I came upon quantum physics. And I just like to borrow it as a metaphor. Of course, quantum physics can't completely overlap with negotiation, but it overlaps with what we're learning in anthropology, in social neuroscience. So that's why I've liked to borrow from quantum physics, meaning that what we've learned beyond the Newtonian scientists, who basically, we lived in an old age where Newtonian scientists believed we were all separate atoms, and we need to be separate, we need to win at being separate. So that really colored the way we looked at our social experiences as well. Win because we are separate. But quantum physicists have showed us that we are all connected by this unseen force of web of networks and subatomic parts that we just can't see it with the physical eyes, but at the invisible or the unseen level, there is all of this connectivity. And I think this is what you and I have liked to study all our life, is we're looking at the unseen parts and just bringing it to be more visible. And luckily with the neuroscience work, because we're doing a lot of work on the brain mapping, we can actually see that the social conditioning of the patriarchal, hierarchical practices are actually splitting us as human beings in our brains. It splits emotion from reason, and it splits the mind from the body. And we have lost our capacity to even understand ourselves, because that kind of conditioning is not natural for the human spirit or for the human condition. So the more we can understand from quantum physics, the unseen elements of all these subatomic parts that are connected, we need to connect our minds and bodies and our emotions from reason. And this way we can then start to understand ourselves better, because to even overcome the domination model, it's neurologically very difficult to understand others, be empathetic of others, if we haven't been empathetic and really understand ourselves as whole human beings, because we've lost touch with our own integrity. So this is why I think this whole world is so interesting in terms of changing the mindset, the social conditioning. Some of the first steps are, let's reconnect ourselves internally as human beings so we can connect with others, because we inherently have a relational, responsive, empathetic conditioning, because it's continuing to be too harmful for us as human beings. So what I have found in the work, a lot of what you are doing, and I've been watching and reading what's happening in social neuroscience, is that the more we can look at changing the structure internally, we can begin to change the structures external to us. And as you say, we created these. We as human beings have created these structures, and it's time to re-examine, because now the human sciences are providing a real map to us in terms of how we have the natural capacity to care and connect, and how it has been disrupted from our detachment from one another, objectifying and dominance practices. And we can see this every day in the world, the way things are being disrupted, that these old assumptions aren't working any longer. The worldview is changing, and the boldness and the daring to care is a call to action. And this is what I have seen in the world of negotiation. It's individuals who are getting in touch with that human capacity of themselves, connecting with others in partnership. You actually generate and speak directly to the loss of relationships that are often found in negotiations. So it's not only the institutional structures that are being disrupted today. I see that the invisible structures in our brain are being disrupted. And the more you learn about social conditioning, which I think is so fascinating, is that we can understand why we learned it one way. And that's why you're such a great educator, Riane, in terms of educating us. How did we learn to use these structures? How can we unlearn these structures in our brains? And then how can we relearn partnership models so we can rebuild and reshape our institutions, which are in a highly disruptive state right now. So in terms of evolution, I think this is a critical time, and that's what's exciting to be working in this field right now, because the timing is really right. So a lot of what I'm interested in is how to reframe our unconscious habits. This is boldness, this is a way to overcome our overwhelm and the anxiety. And sometimes we lose the capacity to care because we become detached to ourselves. So I see quantum negotiators are really part of the resistance movement, of the resistance to coercion, domination, and detachment of ourselves in negotiation. And how do we use a partnership model in our negotiations so we can integrate our personal development goals and desires and dreams, connect that with those that we work with, those that we come in contact with in our communities and in our schools. So I find that the old habits can relatively easily be transformed by having more empathy for ourselves, and then to understand that we are all connected naturally. And this is what quantum physicists are telling us. We already are connected. So it's doing something very natural.
So if we then think we've got these broad sort of web of interactive components sort of on the table, if we focus in on the dynamics of communication and negotiation interpersonally, between people, how do we understand sort of what at that level, what are some examples of how domination thinking functions in that negotiation or communication setting? And then Karen, if you'd help us to get some examples of really how is quantum negotiation transforming, a way of transforming that to a partnership model. Riane?
Well, I want to echo so much of what Karen has touched upon. This really, what we're doing is connecting the dots that have not been connected. And not only connecting dots that have not been connected, but making visible some huge dots, childhood, gender, that have been simply ignored or at best marginalized. So if you want to look at it from the, say, the gendered perspective, in terms of stereotypes now that are part of the domination system, what we're talking about is really focusing more on the relationship, which is what women are socialized to do. Within the domination system, I mean, I have to say this is not a matter of women against men or men against women. It is really a matter of leaving behind the old story, leaving behind the old habits, and changing. But I would love it, Karen, if you would give some examples of some of the techniques that you teach for, first of all, for people really empathizing with themselves and accepting themselves, and then for being able to transfer that to a negotiation where conflict, I mean, there's this myth somehow that what we need is a society where there is no conflict and where we work together, which is absolute nonsense, because people work together all the time in domination systems. Terrorists work together, monopolies work together, criminal gangs work together, and conflict is actually either suppressed in domination systems or it erupts then, and often violently. The idea is to use conflict in a creative way. Keeping in mind some human rights standards always, because we can't just say, well, I understand, why you're an ex-murderer. Fine. I mean, maybe I understand it, but I certainly don't accept that, or why you are so cruel as a society to women and children, as you see in so many areas of fundamentalism, be it Eastern or Western. The idea is give us some examples of some of the techniques, because I think that is something really, really important. How do we shift from our domination conditioning to a partnership mindset, because it starts with our minds, doesn't it?
Right, exactly. So because I have had a lot of experience and I've been so lucky working in a cross-national experience, cross-cultural experience, I think it's interesting to use a couple examples from that to illustrate this, because not only do nations have conflicts with each other, but people from those nations have a mindset that's been acculturated with some national practices and habits. So the one that I find the most interesting as I work in groups cross-culturally, let's take the issue of time. So for example, in southern Mexico, if and I have an example of a team I worked with recently, a group from southern Mexico has a concept of very fluid time, that time is not mañana. And that's not because of any particular laziness. It's conditions in southern Mexico are such that you never know if the car will come on time, or if your ride will come on time, or if the delivery will come on time. You just go with the flow on that. And then when I work with somebody from, let's just say from the Northeast in the US, time is very fixed. Time is money. And when they start to work with each other with these very different national cultures in their mind, they become very defensive with the other because the other isn't rewarding and reinforcing their value around time. So conflict starts right in a little project in the neighborhood because they have this unconscious bias of the value of time. And what we've learned by actually, this is where neuroscience is helping us with this question, we can actually show in the brain, I'm just a layman at this, so if anybody has any better scientific way to say this, but they can now do MRIs with people in negotiation experiences. So someone who's negotiating in a very fluid time culture setting, we can measure hormones and we can measure brain activity, and the oxytocin regarding trust will fire for those in fluid time situations, acculturation. It's not the timing that's so important, but if you show a commitment to the relationship, then the trust neurons will fire. When you're working with somebody very fixed time oriented, and when you say you're going to do something and you do it, then trust fires in the brain. So they can't even build trust with each other because they think of trust and time in very different ways. So what we're looking at in terms of negotiation is, how do I learn that I learned fluid time is really important? And why did I learn that fixed time is so important? When I'm working in a cross-cultural setting, I may need to unlearn my fixed time commitment, and I need to unlearn my fluid time. How can we negotiate a new norm of working in partnership with each other? Not defensive, but how can I be curious? And what we're learning is that when you can shift your preference for fluid and fixed, and remember, everything we're learning in neuroscience is it takes at least 21 days to learn a new habit. It takes a lot of practice to be able to be comfortable with fluid time if I'm in fixed time. But you can actually change, and you can change your behavior. And both sides are much more satisfied with each other. So what I find is the core benefit to understanding how I've learned, how I can style shift, and how I can actually connect better with others. I'm much happier when I can attune to others and they feel better if we can style match, and if we can actually be respectful of each other's preference around time. That's just a mini example, but it happens every day, and it can accelerate into domination if we're not curious about the other's preference for time. It's neither right nor wrong, but it was their social conditioning.
So I'm going to ask you something that I think is probably on the minds of many people who have come to this. How do you negotiate with somebody who is firmly in the domination mindset, like Mr. Trump, for example? What do you do? And can you really overcome this?
Well, the way I always would start with that question is to say, is there a monopoly of power? And some would say if you have full authority, then you have a potential monopoly of power. But I have asked this question all over the world about monopolies. And I always ask, is a monopoly real or perceived? Almost everyone across the globe has said a monopoly is really a perception. So that's number one, that if it is a perception, they think they have the monopoly. Are there other ways to build networks and to gain economic and social resources without negotiating with that authority? So that's number one.
So in other words, you're saying to bypass.
There's all kinds of resources and networks and alliances, and you know, we've all know this, that there are other ways to build alliances. And oftentimes we find that that monopoly can be broken because we shift away to finding those other communities and building resources and networks. So that's number one. And the other is to, every time we often think about a monopoly, we forget what kind of leverage we really have. And that's where I find that quantum negotiators, for example, will redefine what leverage means. It's not just political leverage. It might be economic leverage. It might be consumer leverage. That's why boycotts sometimes work. You have leverage in all kinds of other options and resources. So that is to re-examine and to rethink about your leverage and to think about the various options you have to get your basic needs met. I could talk a lot more about that.
I'd love to talk about more of it, but I'm going to defer to Sara, who's moderating.
Okay, good.
Well, Riane has actually posed a form of the first question that we got to, from a couple people sent some questions in advance that we wanted to be sure to get to, and really that's a version of the first one that was sent in by Laura, who's wondering really about when you are someone who's trying to model partnership. She says, how do you deal with people who, for whatever their reasons are actively trying to sabotage you or the conversation and cause trouble? So not just people who misunderstand you and sort of are good in good faith, so to speak, but people who really aren't, who are in a frame where common ground is not their goal. She says, is the key to continue to abstain from domination tactics, or when you're dealing with someone like that, is it necessary to integrate them into your approach in some way? Is that something that you might speak to, Karen?
Sure. Just let me see. It's that you don't have they do not have a perception of mutual needs, or the reality is they don't have mutual needs?
Well, she's saying people who don't care about finding common ground. So a sort of extreme example dominator, and she uses the word sociopathic, right? Somebody who is, I think she's also thinking about our president. Somebody who is so enmeshed in such a limited definition of win-lose, in which only his winning is at issue in any given interaction. But also, I think her sense from earlier in her question about people, the idea of sabotaging you or causing trouble, that they don't have a sense of shared interest except to sort of mess with you, interfere with your interests, really.
Yeah, I love it. I love that question, because I have done a lot of research on narcissism, and I do a lot of research in the area of mental health as well, and also I look at how cultures are reinforced and rewarded. So because of these two streams of research that I've been looking at, we all need to be aware as negotiators that there's maybe about research is a little different here and there on it, but sociopaths and narcissists, in reality, there's maybe about 2 to 5% of the population, and they tend to go into leadership roles because cultures reward that kind of self-direction, that kind of certainty, that you'll find a lot of that in these top leadership positions. So this is not unusual that that happens because organizations will reward and reinforce that. And then if they really are on that spectrum, they really don't care. And in a culture setting, you're not rewarded to care. So if those are the cases, then there's a lot of examples, both in terms of leadership and authority that's rewarded and reinforced. And then in terms of sociopaths and narcissists being rewarded in top leadership positions, you can know who they are, and they're only 2% of the population. And what we find then is that you will not be able to change their point of view because they're not neurologically or they are not institutionally aligned in any way to modify their behavior. There's no incentive to modify their behavior. But that's such a small portion of what really is going on, both in institutions and in terms of the basic human population. It's a very small, limited. So I do a lot of coaching with people who are responsible to work with narcissists. And we talk a lot about your needs will not get met in that situation, but you need to be very sure what your needs are. And if some of your needs are getting met there, then be reasonable about that. And if they're not, we have a whole world of options and opportunities. More people than not are not narcissists. So,
I want to say the point that you make that unfortunately in our culture, and I'm not just talking about the United States, obviously, in the domination-oriented aspects of cultures worldwide, they reward that small percentage of people with leadership roles. I mean, you have a Stalin, you have a Kim Jong-un, Trump. I mean, so we are really talking about action on two levels.
Yeah.
On one level is to deal with what is at the moment.
Right.
But on the other level, and this is what I really want to bring out here, and this is what we have to really think about, is laying those cornerstones so that the system does not reward the dominator. Because the dominator in our world still controls a lot of the resources and economic resources, political power, military power. So it is only really by thinking in long-term ways, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the people pushing us back think in long-term ways. For then the, quote, traditional family, which is a code for a rigidly male-dominated, authoritarian, punitive family, is fundamental. And yet for so many progressives, these are just women's issues, children's issues, and we're going to focus on what's important. So they keep trying to dismantle the top of the domination pyramid, but it keeps rebuilding itself, whether it's in fundamentalism or totalitarianism or just plain old authoritarianism. So what we have to keep on doing everything we are doing, but begin to use a different frame, a different story, which is that, as I said, the issue is not right versus left or religious versus secular or Eastern versus Western. It's that configuration of the domination system and the partnership system. At the same time, and this is where your work is so important, we also have to learn some strategies for how can we deal with dominators.
Right.
And what I hear you saying is that it's hard, but at the same time, if we also work on changing the system, we have a chance that these people don't have so much control. Because for them, starting in childhood, whatever caring children receive is conflated with coercion. And so no wonder people vote for a coercive, strongman leader. It's, what they're comfortable with. And they will give these people power. And so it is only by changing the foundations at the same time that we, of course, manage as best we can using the kinds of techniques that you're talking about. So this is not a simple, quick fix.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also see that it is one relationship at a time. Sometimes I just want to give up on the whole thing because I started out being interested in massive social change. And then I found that human being to human being, and I've seen it all over the world, the most amazing things happen and change when human beings, just small groups, do these really positive and productive things with each other. And partly I blame it on the seduction of the media and fiction to really dramatize the conflicts as opposed to really showing how many great, wonderful, powerful stories and changes happen every day. So that's why I love what you're doing. You're highlighting these positive changes to people all around the world that are making contributions.
There's no question that there is a strong movement to change some of the foundations.
Yeah.
We're talking about a different way of parenting,
Right.
that's nonviolent. But it goes along with shifting to a partnership configuration. We're talking about all the questioning that so many people are doing of the old gender stereotypes.
Right.
We're talking about all the work that's being done to shift economics. However, we really have to go to the basics.
Mm-hmm.
As long as we think that the struggle is between capitalism and socialism, we're really being distracted from the real issue, which is that both systems ignore, and as we move into the post-industrial age, of course, where economists keep telling us how important, that high-quality human capital is. I mean, we know that from neuroscience that, whether it is or is not produced largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive early on. Right. So this is serious stuff to really begin to connect the dots, and in a different way. And I love your, just changing our story. It doesn't start with the mind. I mean, the mind is a product of the interaction of our biology with our experiences. Right. This said, though, the mind is powerful. And the mind, once it is freed from the fetters imposed by domination, socialization from cradle to grave, really, it can, once it knows what it has to create, then it can, just about everything in our rooms was a human creation. Just it's that simple. Even material objects. Right. So I have people always ask me, am I optimistic? And I say, well, it could go either way, and we see it in the world. The regression to domination is very real, but the movement towards partnership is also very strong.
Exactly.
Once we understand that that's the tension, then we can be much more effective.
Right.
So I wonder, as we think about, and I want to go to a question from Bruce Adams in Colorado, which I think really speaks or kind of digs under the surface of the notions that some of us have around the relationship of diversity in leadership and social change, and whether diversity alone is enough of types of people is enough to change the systems which people are leading. So Bruce says it this way. He says, There seems to be an undercurrent of feeling in social transformation work that just making the decision makers more diverse will be enough to change the system for the better. But I get the feeling, Bruce says, that's not enough. Necessary, absolutely, but not sufficient. A transformed system will look and feel different. For me, this is difficult. How can we make the partnership/respect model feel true in the depths of our being, he says.
I love that. Well, I agree that just diversity, the recognition that difference does not have to be equated with superiority or inferiority. You know, starting with the difference in the male and female forms of humanity that, you know, kids are internalized so early, that it doesn't have to be equated with superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving. Getting rid of that template for, you know, race, for religion, you know, all of the ugly isms, anti-Semitism, racism, etc. That's very important, but it is a piece only. We have to really go much more deeply. And I think that you're right, Bruce, that we have to take a systems approach. And that's why I always talk about 4 cornerstones that are interconnected. And that is a long-term job that we have ahead of us. And so, yes, the answer is diversity. Valuing diversity is a revolutionary idea in domination systems, which are based on in-group versus out-group thinking and behavior. At the same time, no, it's not enough.
Yeah, I agree too with both of you that I think that's what's interesting about that field, the field of diversity. A lot of it had to do with more external definitions of social conditioning that led to diverse individuals. And what we're learning today, similar to the example I gave about time, is that there are these invisible barriers that we have, and we also need to think of diversity as in cognitive diversity, just different ways of thinking, different world views, that they don't necessarily, just because all of us have some experience growing up in the US or in Germany, for example, we're not like everybody else from those experiences. And it's more about the individual understanding, being curious about the cognitive diversity within these leadership teams that you're referring to. So having quotas around diversity, we don't have the same kind of success as we thought we would, because we're not addressing how do we respect the cognitive diversity, the value differences, then to be curious, and then to renegotiate some new norms with each other when we have very different worldviews. So I find that's the greatest meta-negotiation that all of us do every day, is how are we going to negotiate with each other? Can we understand our own attachments to our own preferences and how we might want to dominate others in a leadership team because my way, the way I learned it, is correct. So this curiosity to understand, why did you learn to be so fixed time or political, whatever it might be? That kind of curiosity can change the relationship and can change the dynamics of the organization, and it cannot change systems. But it's about being more curious about others' worldview.
And what are the conditions that support that curiosity from being present in those interactions? I mean, what are the, do you know what I'm saying? Like what, where do you find that curiosity sort of organically showing up, and where, and how do you engender that in spaces that have historically suppressed that curiosity?
Riane, did you want to take that, or should I take that?
No, I'll let you take it. and I'll add to it.
Okay, good. What I love about that is this is what I think of as leadership. And really knowing who I am and understanding that I have real preferences around time or communication or equity or whatever it might be. Just really, really knowing myself, knowing that I do have these attachments. And the leadership is bringing the curiosity to the group, bringing that ability to style shift and to understand that viewpoint, and then to lead a negotiation of a new world view, a new viewpoint, a new norm for how we're going to work with each other, because we're coming from different viewpoints. This is a meta negotiation of leading in the creation of a new norm. It's not a battle of wills, but it's a negotiation, co-creating new norms that will accommodate this cross-cultural viewpoint. No matter what the culture is, it could be within a neighborhood, as an example. So
I would say,
go ahead.
oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was just going to say that it's almost like it's the leadership to bring your confidence to sit and create an experience of sharing a different story and not defending your story, but be able to appreciate that story and create a new norm. It comes
And
with
I
that
think
leadership.
new norms is the key. But I want to address a thing that we've been sort of skirting around, which is a safe environment. Because for people to be able to even drop some of, the facades and some of the defenses. And I was wondering, how do you go about creating that safe environment?
And that is really good point, because the prerequisite to this leader creating this opportunity to share the story comes by the leader creating a safe environment. And one of the most profound things I learned when I started reading the work on emotional intelligence, the scientific definition of it, was that we all have the ability to emotionally entrain others to feel safe or to manage fear. And one way is to make them so afraid that they will comply to your wishes. This is the dominance model, is built on you can't emotionally entrain fearful people to do something they necessarily would not do, because you as a leader know that the fear exists. It's easy to be authoritative because they're so afraid. However, someone with the ability to have emotional intelligence as a leader knows that people are generally, there's this hum of being a little afraid, a little defensive. But if you set the stage of a safe environment of exchange, transparency, and there's an ability to explore mutual needs, parties feel safer, but it comes by the leadership that will set the frame so the parties are not as afraid in that environment.
And how does the leader do that?
I find the most important piece I have found with people I find who use as a leadership quality, they do a lot of personal work themselves. They understand where their triggers are, where their fears are. And they also find great alliances with others who want to be leaders in this more partnership way. I find that the more that they belong to a community of others, a practice community, for example, and that's why your community to me represents that, the more you can share with each other some of the fears you have with being courageous in a meeting where you know you're going to hit resistance. We find that more people than not also want to feel safe, want to be able to be heard, want you to help them meet their needs. They need to get stuff done. They will respond more positively. And this is what we're finding out with the way the heart and the brain work together. If you can connect with them in that emotional way, that they feel safe, that you're going to get a lot more opportunities and more sharing.
And that's exactly what we found in our courses.
Yes.
Where people just share the most personal information because they feel safe. And I have to say that I really agree that, but there's a vulnerability. to that, because if you're dealing with a really seasoned dominator,
Yeah, right.
They'll take that and
Right.
but you know, the truth of the matter is in what you also mentioned, which is this human yearning for caring connection
Yeah.
is so
Right.
strong. And there are people, I mean, some of it is a self-selection process. I mean, I would wager that the people who have come to this webinar have self-selected. They are people who realize that the old ways are not only painful, but they're unhealthy, they're dysfunctional, and that the old solutions are like band-aids, you know, and the old thinking is like band-aids. So they're here. Um, and, you know, there's always this question that nags at us. What do we do to change the system so it doesn't reward the dominator? I mean, I think that is, and I wonder how in negotiation you can set it up so that people can begin to see that their real needs aren't being met. Because most people are not that percentage, you know, who are so rigid.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the neuroscience seems to indicate that they really cannot change.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's where we are in the, you know, in the research at this point. But the vast majority of people, even some of the ones who have adopted domination mindsets and tactics, really aren't satisfied.
Right.
And it is then appealing to their needs. And how do you address that?
Well, two ways. One is maybe, Sarah, if you could show the slides on our quantum the basic framework around quantum is to actually think about yourself as we like to use the metaphor of a buoy. So if I really understand who I am, and we're going to talk about that in terms of my full human potential. If I really know who I am and I have clarity about what I want, and more importantly, why I want it, and I also have an understanding of what if I can't reach an agreement with this individual, what are my other options? I have leverage in so many other areas I'm able to do that. And the other is that I really think a little bit about how I want to behave. So if I'm very solid in understanding who I am, I can be buoyant. That is, I can style shift then to listening to your story, to be empathetic, but I am firmly anchored in who I am and what it is that I need. And go to the next slide, please. So fundamentally, this question that you're asking is, and it's interesting because so much of preparation in negotiation is around what I need. And then a lot of work in negotiation is around how I'm going to use my strategy and tactics. And what we have found is that the deeper you understand who you are, if you go to the next slide, Sarah, that what we have found in our research is because we are these full human beings, if I really have thought about, like, for example, on my cognitive level, the way I think, do I generally think the world is zero sum, or do I think the world is very benevolent and there's abundance? So I think about my own ways of thinking, my structure, my frame. And then I feel, do I go into this negotiation feeling afraid, or do I feel positive? In terms of my social behavior, do I want to behave in a collaborative way or in a domination way? That you've deliberately, intentionally planned to use these behavior. And then we also think, am I prepared physically today? Maybe I'm just too tired. I can't step to another party's side. I can't listen. I can't be curious because I'm jet lagged or I have a pain in my shoulder. And then the other dimension, which I have found more often than not, we detach our spiritual belief from our whole potential as a human being when we go into negotiation. That is, what do I really believe in? What is my real purpose? in life in general, this negotiation or other. And the reason why these are so critical as anchors, that you can be then very buoyant in a very turbulent situation. Most negotiations will trigger a lot of us, whether it's a 5-minute negotiation with your neighbor or a 5-year negotiation with the school district, that they are going to feel turbulent in our nervous system. But the more that you know yourself, no one can make you do anything. And this is where the power of neuroscience, the power of what we're learning about our spiritual anchoring, the power of our intentions to behave in the world in a way that we want to, that kind of anchoring helps a lot with the ability to, what we would say is to walk away to something else, to build alliances somewhere else. Get your needs met on all of these dimensions, either with this party or the other. And I think one of the most significant things we found in the research is the more you have empathy and integration with yourself on these dimensions, you really have integrity internally, the world just seems friendlier. The world just seems more benevolent. You actually start, and that's what we're learning about the resonance of our electromagnetic system, that our electromagnetic system is going to either send dissonance out to others or actually build some sort of magnetism and safety with others, because they can actually, their nervous system can read the disturbance within our own nervous system.
So I want to add something to this, because what this all presupposes is that you have a seat at the table, at the negotiating table. And unfortunately, a lot of people in our world don't even get there. They don't have a seat at all. So we're back, I mean, as important as it is to know how to negotiate, I think that even before we get to that, the issue is, how do we help more people who have been dominated, who have also dominated others, okay, very often, because it's you kick the dog, that's the last thing you do. I mean, after the wife and the children and, etc. So we're talking about privilege, which we have to be at the negotiating table. And how can we best use that privilege? But I also would like us to think of the whole system and how many people don't get to the negotiating table.
And this is why we should have started with this. Remember, we talked about this before. We should start with the definition of what we mean by negotiation.
Yeah, and
we are actually talking about
family. It can be, yes. but I mean, like a woman in a fundamentalist Muslim household, okay? She does not have the power to negotiate. She can manipulate, but if she tries to negotiate, she can be killed. It's that simple.
But what we were also pointing out is that anytime you're sharing a resource, anytime you're creating something new, and anytime you're problem solving, you are in a negotiation. So when we look at negotiation, it isn't necessarily some authoritative or contract negotiation. It's our daily activity of getting our needs met. And it's interesting you use a Muslim woman as an example, because I've done some negotiation classes with Iraqi and Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan. And it was interesting that a lot of the women doctors would talk about not manipulating the husbands of the wives who needed to have some birth control. She actually was using a partnership model as she negotiated with the husband to be able to get his wife with the right birth control that she needed, because she was extremely ill.
Yeah, so, but the point is that the wife could not negotiate with the husband.
Yes, but the doctor knew that.
But the doctor knew that. Yeah, I mean, I am using it in the very broadest sense.
I agree with you. Exactly.
So we're always back to this balancing
Right,
of the social environment and the techniques.
right.
And the
That's why I
fact
love
that
the interplay between them.
and
Right,
we must have the techniques as social activists,
right.
like the doctor
Yeah,
that
right.
you mentioned. I mean, there's just so much more to talk about.
And yet we are running very short on time. So um, we're at our last 5 minutes, and I do want to um, offer just another moment for each of you to share some final thoughts or words or calls to action of in whatever form those take for each of you, and then we can confirm. Actually, before I do that, let me just confirm for everyone listening that you will be, and I'm sure Anne is saying this in the chat right now, but I'll say it out loud, that if you have registered for this webinar, you'll receive a very juicy, packed full follow-up email with links and resources, the access that Riane mentioned to getting a discounted copy of her new book, pre-ordering that, links to Karen's book, as well as a link to the recording of this session that you can watch again or replay parts that you wanted to tune into a second time. And I've seen in the chat that there's been a question about accessing the chat itself as a resource, and we can make that available to everyone as well. So those are my little technical final closing notes before I offer you, maybe we'll go to Karen first and then to Riane to just close us out.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Riane, to have this great conversation today. I look forward to many, many more. And what I'd like to say is that on a day like today, I feel extremely optimistic about the generation of more partnerships and relationships that are positive and sustainable. And I need hits like this to keep myself in a positive state of mind. So keep up all the work all of you are doing. It doesn't get enough attention, I don't believe. So I'm glad that I can tap into it with you all today. And thank you for sharing the forum with us.
Well, and I want to close, first of all, by thanking Karen, thanking Sara, thanking Jason and Anne behind the scenes, and thanking all of you for being part of this. You are part of the partnership movement. And as long as we really keep in mind that a lot of what's happening is not random and disconnected, we are challenging traditions of domination, whether it's in negotiating, whether it's in gender stereotypes, whether it's in childhood, whether it's the kind of economic system, which is fundamental. I mean, I really, aside from recommending my new book, Nurturing Our Humanity, I really also, well, for Chalice, but read The Real Wealth of Nations, because there are some underlying structural and economic realities that we have to change. And the only way to change them is to change and really shift to a caring economics, where caring for people and caring for nature is given economic rewards. And that changes the whole equation, doesn't it? As to who can negotiate, including that woman we talked about who couldn't negotiate, who needed a third party with some status and power to even talk to her husband about something that is so fundamental as a human right, her access to family planning. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's so exciting, isn't it? And you meet so many wonderful, wonderful people. And it is on this note that I want to close, of gratitude for all of you, and for this new world, this new partnership-oriented world that we're all creating.